And he said that not only were the cameras smashed, plural cameras smashed, so that the suspect likely knew about the locations of them, but that the car belonging to the sister of Savannah Guthrie, Annie Guthrie, was towed, impounded, and taken into evidence. And this is the wording. It's very important. The wording is very important. He said they now believe the son-in-law may be the prime suspect. Those are the words. Son-in-law may be the prime suspect at the...
And Nancy's pacemaker was recording throughout the entire night. She disappeared. The FBI has spent months working to decode what that device captured. What they found inside the data has transformed this investigation from a missing person case into something far more complex. Because the pacemaker did not just record that Nancy disappeared, it recorded how her body responded physiologically to whatever happened to her during a 41-minute window in the early morning hours of February 1st. It recorded her heart rate spiking in apparent terror. It recorded patterns consistent with being physically moved against her will. And in the final minutes before the device stopped transmitting data to the cloud, it recorded cardiac patterns that forensic specialists say are consistent with pharmacological sedation. Since this is the story of what Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker saw. This is the story of 41 minutes that changed everything. And this is the story of how cutting-edge cardiac forensics is being used to reconstruct what happened to an 84-year-old grandmother on the night she was taken from her home. If this type of detailed investigative content is what brings you to true crime, you are in exactly the right place. This is True Crime Dre, and we go deeper than headlines. We analyze evidence. We break down forensics. We follow the data wherever it leads. If that is the kind of coverage you want, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update on this case or any other investigation we cover. And if you appreciate the depth we bring to these stories, leave a like on this video. It helps more than you know. Now, let me take you through what happened to Nancy Guthrie, minute by minute, heartbeat by heartbeat. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She lives alone in her home in the Catalina foothills, a residential area north of Tucson. She has family nearby. Her daughter Annie lives in the area with her husband. Nancy is described by those who know her as independent, active for her age, and devoted to her family. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy did what she had done many times before. She went to her daughter Annie's house for dinner. She spent the evening with Annie and Annie's husband. By all accounts, it was a normal family evening. Dinner, conversation, time spent together. Nothing about that night seemed unusual or out of the ordinary. But Nancy's pacemaker was recording her cardiac data throughout the evening. The device logs show completely normal baseline activity during the hours she spent at her daughter's home. Her heart rate was stable. There were no arrhythmias, no significant cardiac events, just the steady, unremarkable rhythm of an 84-year-old woman having dinner with her family. At 9:50 in the evening, Nancy prepared to go home. Her son-in-law drove her back to her house in the Catalina foothills. The drive took approximately 15 to 20 minutes. During that entire drive, her pacemaker continued recording normal baseline cardiac activity. There was nothing in the data from that car ride that suggested anything unusual. Her heart rate remained stable and consistent with someone being transported in a vehicle under normal, calm conditions. Nancy arrived home at approximately 10:10 in the evening. The garage door of her home closed behind her. She entered her house. And again, the pacemaker data from this period shows nothing abnormal. She was home. She was safe. Her cardiac readings were exactly what you would expect from an elderly woman settling in for the night. But then, something changed. Between 10:50 and 11:30 that night, approximately 45 minutes to an hour after Nancy arrived home, her pacemaker logged something different. Her heart rate showed a brief elevation above her normal resting baseline. It was not a dramatic spike. It was not an arrhythmia or a dangerous cardiac event, but it was measurable. Her heart rate increased, stayed elevated for a few minutes, and then returned to baseline. Forensic cardiologists who have reviewed this pattern describe it as consistent with a stress response. The kind of brief cardiac elevation you might see when someone hears an unexpected noise, when someone is startled by something, When a moment of alertness or mild anxiety triggers the body's physiological response systems, on its own, this elevation is not conclusive of anything sinister. There are many benign explanations. Nancy could have gotten up to get a glass of water. She could have heard a dog barking outside. She could have seen something on television that momentarily captured her attention or caused a brief emotional response. There is no way to know for certain what caused that heart rate increase, but it is there, it is time-stamped, and it is the first deviation from an otherwise completely normal evening. But investigators have noted this anomaly because of what happens later. In hindsight, in the context of everything that followed, that brief spike in heart rate takes on potential significance. It may have been nothing, or it may have been the first indication that something was beginning. After that brief elevation, Nancy's cardiac data stabilized again. Between 11:30 in the evening and approximately 1:30 in the morning, her pacemaker logs show relatively stable patterns. Her heart rate lowered. Her rhythm became regular. The data is consistent with rest, possibly sleep, though the device cannot definitively confirm deep sleep. What it can confirm is that her body was in a resting state. There were no significant cardiac events logged during this window. No arrhythmias, no heart rate spikes, just the quiet, steady rhythm of someone at rest in their own home. For hours, everything appeared normal. And then, 1:47 in the morning arrived. Nancy Guthrie had a Google Nest doorbell camera installed at the front entrance of her home. Like many modern security cameras, this device records footage and uploads it to cloud storage. That cloud backup feature would become critically important to this investigation. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, that doorbell camera captured something. The footage shows a figure approaching Nancy's front door. The figure is wearing a mask. The figure is carrying a backpack. And investigators have stated that the figure appears to be carrying a firearm. At 1:47 in the morning, that masked figure disabled the camera. The recording stops. Whoever approached Nancy's home knew the camera was there and took steps to shut it down. But here is what makes that moment so significant. The Google Nest system had already uploaded footage to the cloud before the camera was disabled. When investigators later examined Nancy's account, they found that cloud backup intact. The footage survived, and that footage provides a precise timestamp for when Nancy's home was breached. 1:47 in the morning. Now let me tell you what Nancy's pacemaker was recording at that exact moment. Between 1:40 and 1:50 in the morning, in the same narrow window that the doorbell camera shows the masked figure approaching and disabling the camera, Nancy's pacemaker logged a significant cardiac event. Her heart rate elevated sharply. The elevation was not gradual. It was sudden. And it was dramatic. And it was sustained. Forensic cardiologists describe this pattern as consistent with an acute stress response. This is the cardiac signature of fear. This is what happens physiologically when a person is suddenly and severely frightened. When someone is startled awake by an intruder. When the body's fight or flight response kicks in and floods the system with adrenaline. The timestamp on Nancy's cardiac elevation and the timestamp on the camera being disabled are within the same narrow window. That is not a coincidence. That is Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker recording her body's physiological reaction to the moment her abduction began. The camera went dark at 1:47. Nancy's heart rate spiked at the same time. And from that moment forward, everything that happened to Nancy Guthrie for the next 41 minutes was recorded inside the device in her chest. The window between 1:47 in the morning and 2:28 in the morning is 41 minutes. That 41-minute span has been the center of this investigation since the moment Nancy was reported missing. Because during those 41 minutes, there is no external surveillance footage. Nancy's phone was left behind in her home, so there is no cell phone data. There is no GPS data from a vehicle she owned. There are no witnesses who saw anything. No neighbors reported hearing anything unusual. Externally, those 41 minutes are a complete blackout. But internally, inside Nancy's body, her pacemaker was recording everything her heart was doing in response to whatever was happening to her. Let me walk you through what that data shows, phase by phase. The first phase begins immediately after 1:47. Nancy's heart rate, which spiked sharply at the moment the camera was disabled, does not drop back down. It stays elevated. For a sustained period, her heart rate remains significantly above her normal baseline. This is not a brief startle response that resolves quickly. This is a prolonged state of acute stress. The pacemaker logs show that the elevated heart rate continues for approximately the first 15 minutes following the camera being disabled. During this time, the device also logs irregular rhythm variations. These variations are recorded as arrhythmia events. They are not medically dangerous arrhythmias in the clinical sense, but they are rhythm irregularities that cardiologists associate with extreme emotional distress. What this data tells investigators is clear. Nancy was conscious. She was aware of what was happening, and she was terrified. The sustained elevated heart rate and the rhythm irregularities are the physiological signatures of someone experiencing sustained fear. Whatever happened in those first 15 minutes after 1:47 was not brief. It was ongoing. Nancy was not calmed. She was not reassured. She was frightened, and she remained frightened for an extended period. Then the second phase begins. Approximately 15 to 20 minutes into the 41-minute window, the pacemaker data shows a new pattern. Modern pacemakers are equipped with accelerometer technology. This technology measures physical movement, and it is designed to adjust the pacing rate based on the wearer's activity level. If someone is walking, the accelerometer detects that movement, and the pacemaker adjusts accordingly. If someone is lying still, the device recognizes that as well. The accelerometer in Nancy's pacemaker recorded something specific during this phase. The data shows what forensic specialists describe as movement-correlated cardiac variation. But the pattern of movement is significant. It is not consistent with voluntary walking. It is not consistent with Nancy moving herself through her house under her own power. The accelerometer pattern is consistent with passive movement, with being carried, with being transported by someone else. Nancy Guthrie was no longer moving on her own. The data shows she was being moved, and the characteristics of that movement, but based on the accelerometer logs, are consistent with being placed into a vehicle and then transported. This phase of sustained movement continues for a period that investigators estimate to be approximately 15 to 20 minutes. The movement pattern shows the rhythmic vibration signatures that specialists associate with vehicle travel. Not walking, not stationary positioning. Movement that matches the profile of someone being transported in a car or truck. And then comes the third phase. In the final 10 to 15 minutes before the pacemaker stops transmitting data to the cloud, the cardiac pattern changes again. And this change is the most clinically significant finding in the entire data set. Nancy's heart rate, which had been elevated throughout most of the 41 minutes, begins to show a specific type of variability. Or more accurately, it begins to show a reduction in variability. Heart rate variability is a measure of the natural beat-to-beat variation in heart rhythm. A conscious, alert person has measurable heart rate variability. The central nervous system continuously regulates the heart, and that regulation produces natural variation. But when someone loses consciousness, or when someone is sedated, that natural variability decreases. The central nervous system's influence on cardiac function is reduced, and the heart rate pattern changes in a specific, measurable way. Nancy's pacemaker data from the final 10 to 15 minutes before transmission stops shows decreased heart rate variability. Forensic cardiologists who have analyzed this pattern describe it as consistent with pharmacological sedation, and with a drug-induced alteration of consciousness. The pattern is not consistent with cardiac arrest. It is not the pattern of someone dying. Nancy's heart continued beating. The pacemaker continued functioning. But the variability pattern suggests that Nancy's level of consciousness was significantly altered. The clinical interpretation is that sometime in the final minutes of the 41-minute window, Nancy was sedated. Something was administered to her that reduced her consciousness. Whether by injection, inhalation, or some other method, the cardiac data supports the conclusion that Nancy was no longer fully conscious by the time the transmission stopped. And at 2:28 in the morning, the transmission did stop. At 2:28, Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with its paired monitoring device. And most modern pacemakers sync wirelessly with a home monitoring unit. Nancy had such a system. Her pacemaker transmitted data to a bedside monitoring base that then uploaded that information to the device manufacturer's cloud platform. This allowed her cardiologist to remotely monitor her heart health and receive alerts if anything concerning was detected. At 2:28 in the morning, that wireless sync was broken. The pacemaker stopped communicating with the home monitoring unit. No more data reached the cloud. This does not mean the pacemaker stopped working. The device inside Nancy's chest continued recording. It continued logging every cardiac event, every heartbeat, every physiological change. But that data was now stored only internally. It was no longer being transmitted. And that internal data is inaccessible to investigators until Nancy is found. There are several reasons the sync could have stopped at 2:28. The monitoring unit could have been moved out of range. The pacemaker could have been moved out of range of the monitoring unit, meaning Nancy was moved beyond the signal's reach. The monitoring unit could have been powered off or disabled, or there could have been physical interference with the signal. The most likely explanation, based on the movement data from the accelerometer in the minutes before 2:28, is that Nancy was transported far enough away from her home that the wireless connection between her pacemaker and the home monitoring unit was broken by distance. 41 minutes after the camera was disabled, Nancy Guthrie was no longer in range of her home monitoring system. And from that point forward, everything the pacemaker recorded stayed inside the device, inside Nancy. The FBI became involved in this case almost immediately after Nancy was reported missing. And within the first week of the investigation, federal agents took a step that demonstrates just how sophisticated modern forensic techniques have become. They subpoenaed the pacemaker data from the device manufacturer. Accessing pacemaker data in a forensic context is not simple. These devices are manufactured by companies like Medtronic, Abbott, and Boston Scientific. Each manufacturer uses proprietary software to read the internal logs of their devices. In a clinical setting, when a patient comes in for a checkup, a cardiologist uses a specialized device called a programmer to wirelessly interrogate the pacemaker and download its full memory. But Nancy is missing. Investigators cannot ask her to come in for a device download, so they have to work with what is available. And what is available is the data that was transmitted to the manufacturer's cloud platform before the sync stopped at 2:28. Many modern pacemakers do not just sync with a bedside device. They sync continuously with the manufacturer's cloud monitoring system. Nancy's device was part of such a system. Her pacemaker transmitted data to a cloud platform that stored her cardiac information. That cloud data includes everything the device recorded and transmitted up to the moment the sync broke. The FBI subpoenaed that cloud data. The manufacturer complied. And the forensic cardiac analysis that followed has been ongoing for months. The FBI does not just have IT specialists working on this, they have forensic cardiologists on their team, cardiac device specialists who understand how to interpret the data, manufacturer liaisons who can explain the technical details of how the device logs information, and legal experts who ensure that the chain of custody preserves the evidentiary value of everything recovered. The analysis of that data is what has produced the timeline I just walked you through. The acute stress response at 1:47, the sustained elevated heart rate and rhythm irregularities in the first 15 minutes, the movement-correlated accelerometer data showing passive transport, and the decreased heart rate variability pattern in the final minutes consistent with sedation. And every piece of that timeline comes from the pacemaker, from the device that was silently recording inside Nancy Guthrie's chest while her abduction unfolded. What this data tells investigators goes far beyond simply confirming that Nancy was taken. It tells them how the abduction was carried out, and the implications of what the data reveals are significant. First, the pharmacological sedation. If the cardiac data interpretation is correct, and the decreased heart rate variability in the final phase is indeed consistent with sedation, then whoever took Nancy came prepared. Sedatives are not something you accidentally have in your possession. You acquire them. You plan for them. You bring them intentionally. The presence of a sedating agent in this abduction tells investigators that the planning for this operation included pharmacological preparation. This was not an opportunistic crime. This was not someone who saw Nancy and made a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a deeply premeditated, logistically sophisticated operation. The type of sedative that produces the cardiac pattern visible in the pacemaker data also has a specific profile. The compounds that cause rapid onset sedation with the kind of heart rate variability changes seen in Nancy's data are controlled substances. Medical-grade compounds. These are not substances you can buy at a pharmacy. They are not available over the counter. They are the kinds of drugs that leave a procurement trail. Prescription records, hospital acquisition logs, pharmacy dispensing records. Someone who obtained what was used on Nancy Guthrie did not get it casually, and the FBI knows that. The procurement trail of that sedative, wherever it leads, is one of the most significant investigative threads currently being followed. Second, the data tells investigators that Nancy was alive at 2:28 in the morning. The cardiac patterns showing sedation are not the patterns of cardiac arrest or death. The heart was still beating. The pacemaker was still functioning. The patterns are consistent with someone who is unconscious or deeply sedated, but alive. That is a critical piece of information. It establishes that as of 2:28, on the morning of February 1st, Nancy Guthrie was still alive. What happened after that moment is unknown because the data stopped transmitting. But at the moment, the sync broke. Here she was alive. Third, the movement data provides geographic constraints. The accelerometer logs show sustained movement beginning in the middle of the 41-minute window. The duration and character of that movement is consistent with vehicle transportation. Based on the timestamps, investigators estimate that the vehicle was in motion for approximately 15 to 20 minutes before the sync stopped at 2:28. 15 to 20 minutes of vehicle travel from Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills, at the speeds accessible on highway routes south of Tucson in the middle of the night, puts the vehicle anywhere from 12 to 25 miles from Nancy's home at the moment the sync stopped. That geographic radius, 12 to 25 miles in all directions from the Catalina foothills, is now a primary focus of the investigation's spatial analysis. And when you overlay that radius on a map, certain corridors become immediately significant. The interstate route heading south toward Rio Rico and the Mexican border falls within that radius. Within 15 to 20 minutes of highway travel from Nancy's home, heading south, a vehicle could reach areas that have since become focal points of law enforcement activity. Investigators have conducted operations in areas south of Tucson, and the fact that those areas fall within the geographic radius suggested by the pacemaker movement data is not considered coincidental. The FBI has also deployed another technology in the effort to locate Nancy. Modern pacemakers emit a low-power Bluetooth signal when they are in proximity to a compatible reader device. This signal is used by home monitoring systems to collect data from the pacemaker and transmit it to the cloud. The signal has a relatively short range, typically 15 to 30 feet, though this varies depending on the device model and environmental conditions. Within days of Nancy's disappearance, the FBI deployed specialized equipment designed to detect this type of Bluetooth signal. The equipment is essentially a sophisticated receiver that can identify the specific Bluetooth signature of Nancy's pacemaker model and manufacturer. This allows investigators to search an area for any signal that matches her device's profile. In theory, if Nancy is alive and her pacemaker is functioning, and if investigators bring the detection equipment within range of her location, the equipment should pick up the signal. But the practical challenges are significant. The range is short, very short. Detection requires the search equipment to be within approximately 15 to 30 feet of Nancy's body. And if Nancy is inside a building, underground, inside a vehicle, or in any environment that provides shielding, the signal may not reach the detector even from within that range. To have any realistic chance of detecting her signal, investigators need to search the right geographic area. And that is why the pacemaker movement data, which constrains the possible locations to a 12 to 25-mile radius, is so critical. It narrows the search area to something manageable. Without that constraint, searching for a Bluetooth signal with a 30-foot range across the entire state of Arizona would be impossible. As of the most recent reports, the Bluetooth detection effort is ongoing. Investigators continue to deploy the equipment in targeted areas within the geographic radius identified by the pacemaker data. Whether those efforts have produced results has not been publicly disclosed. Federal investigations do not typically release operational details while the investigation is active. But the effort continues. The sophistication of this investigation reflects a broader trend in forensic science. Medical devices are becoming evidence. The data they collect is becoming part of criminal investigations. Pacemakers, fitness trackers, insulin pumps, continuous glucose monitors. All of these devices log data. They timestamp events. They create digital records of physiological activity. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that data has provided investigators with something they have never had before in a case like this: a physiological reconstruction of an abduction. Not a witness account, which can be unreliable. Not a theory, which can be disputed. But a reconstruction built from the recordings of Nancy's own heart. The pacemaker data shows that Nancy was conscious and terrified at the beginning. It shows that she was moved. It shows that her consciousness was altered. It shows that she was alive at 2:28. And it constrains the geographic area where she could have been taken. None of that would have been possible even 10 years ago. The technology did not exist. The forensic techniques had not been developed. But now they have. And in this case, they are being used to try to bring Nancy Guthrie home. 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie has been missing for months. Her family continues to wait for answers. Law enforcement continues to follow every lead, every piece of data, every fragment of evidence that might point toward her location. The pacemaker inside her chest recorded 41 minutes of her abduction. It documented her fear. It documented the moment she was moved. It documented the moment her consciousness was altered. And then, at 2:28 in the morning, it stopped transmitting. But it did not stop recording. Somewhere, that device is still inside Nancy. And if she is found, the data it has continued to log since 2:28 could provide answers that nothing else can. It could tell investigators what happened after the sync stopped. It could provide medical information about her condition. It could offer evidence that leads to the person responsible. The search continues. The investigation continues. And the data inside that pacemaker remains one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this entire case. This is true crime doctrine. If this level of detailed evidence-based analysis is the kind of true crime content you want to see, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button to support this coverage, and stay tuned because there is more to this case, more evidence, more investigative developments, and more questions that still need answers. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker has already told investigators more than any witness could. The question now is whether it will lead them to where she is. The search for Nancy Guthrie is not being conducted blindly. The pacemaker data that documented 41 minutes of her abduction has given investigators something they rarely have in a missing person case: geographic constraints, a focused search zone, a radius within which Nancy was located at 2:28 in the morning when her device stopped transmitting to the cloud. That radius is 12 to 25 miles from her home in the Catalina foothills. Understanding how investigators arrived at that number requires understanding what the accelerometer data inside the pacemaker actually recorded. Modern pacemakers include accelerometer technology. This technology measures physical movement. It adjusts the pacing rate based on activity level. When someone walks, the accelerometer detects that movement. When someone is stationary, the device recognizes that as well. And when someone is being transported in a vehicle, the accelerometer records patterns that are distinct from voluntary movement. Nancy's pacemaker recorded sustained movement beginning in the middle of the 41-minute window. The characteristics of that movement, based on the accelerometer logs, are consistent with vehicle transportation: not walking, not being carried short distances. The pattern matches what specialists associate with someone being transported in a car or truck over a sustained distance. The movement data shows this transportation lasted approximately 15 to 20 minutes before the sync stopped at 2:28. 15 to 20 minutes of vehicle travel from Nancy's home at the speeds accessible on highway routes in the Tucson area in the middle of the night. It constrains the possible location of that vehicle to a specific geographic radius: 12 to 25 miles in all directions from the Catalina foothills. That radius is now the primary focus of the FBI's spatial analysis. And when you overlay that radius on a map of the Tucson area, certain corridors become immediately significant. The interstate route heading south toward Rio Rico and the Mexican border falls within that radius. Within 15 to 20 minutes of highway travel from Nancy's home, heading in that direction, a vehicle could reach areas that have since become focal points of law enforcement operations. Investigators have conducted operations in areas south of Tucson, is the fact that those areas fall within the geographic radius suggested by the pacemaker movement data is not considered coincidental by those familiar with the investigation. The Bluetooth detection effort that the FBI deployed within days of Nancy's disappearance is directly connected to this geographic analysis. Modern pacemakers emit a low-power Bluetooth signal when they are in proximity to a compatible reader device. This signal is used by home monitoring systems to collect data and transmit it to the manufacturer's cloud platform. The signal has a short range, typically 15 to 30 feet, though this varies depending on device model and environmental conditions. The FBI has deployed specialized equipment designed to detect this type of Bluetooth signal. The equipment functions as a sophisticated receiver that can identify the specific Bluetooth signature of Nancy's pacemaker model and manufacturer. This allows investigators to search an area for any signal that matches her device profile. The challenge is range. Detection requires the search equipment to be within approximately 15 to 30 feet of Nancy's body. If Nancy is inside a building, underground, inside a vehicle, or in any environment that provides shielding between her and the detector, the signal may not reach the equipment even from within that range. To have any realistic chance of detecting her signal, investigators must search the right geographic area. Without geographic constraints, searching for a Bluetooth signal with a 30-foot range across hundreds of square miles would be an impossible task. Yet this is where the pacemaker movement data becomes directly connected to the detection effort. The accelerometer and cardiac data analysis constrains Nancy's probable location at the time the sync stopped to that 12 to 25-mile radius. That gives the detection team a prioritized search zone. Instead of searching randomly, they can focus detection efforts on areas most consistent with what the cardiac data reveals about vehicle travel distance and direction. Law enforcement has been conducting detection sweeps in specific geographic areas based on this analysis. The details of exactly where those sweeps have focused are not public, and they should not be public. If Nancy is in one of those locations and the search approach is disclosed prematurely, the people holding her could move her. Operational security in an active investigation requires that certain details remain protected. But the sweeps are happening. They have been happening since the first week of February, and they continue today. The specific manufacturer and model of Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker has not been publicly confirmed. This is intentional on the part of investigators. The manufacturer's capabilities and the specific data logging features of the device are part of the forensic picture that law enforcement does not want to fully disclose while the investigation remains active. What is known from general reporting is that Nancy's device included cloud monitoring capability. It was connected to a home base unit that transmitted data to the manufacturer's servers at regular intervals. This is a feature offered by all major cardiac device manufacturers. The FDA requires certain data transmission standards for devices marketed in the United States, and modern monitoring systems are sophisticated. The major manufacturers of implantable cardiac devices that include this level of data logging and monitoring capability include several large medical technology companies. Each of these companies has legal and compliance teams that handle law enforcement requests for data access. Each has established protocols for responding to federal subpoenas. The FBI's subpoena for Nancy's pacemaker cloud data was issued early in the investigation. The manufacturer complied. The forensic team's analysis of that data is what produced the cardiac timeline documented in the first part of this coverage. But the manufacturer's role does not end with providing stored data. The same cloud monitoring platform that stored Nancy's pre-sync data also has the ability to detect and log any future sync events if Nancy's pacemaker ever comes back into range of a home monitoring unit or a clinical programmer. This is a critical point. If Nancy's pacemaker is ever interrogated by a clinical device, if she is brought to a hospital, if a clinician with a device programmer gets close enough to her pacemaker to perform a download, that event would be logged. The manufacturer would know. And under the terms of the FBI's ongoing legal process with the manufacturer, that notification would reach investigators. This is one of the reasons why, if the people who took Nancy have any understanding of how these devices work, they would be very careful about allowing her anywhere near a medical facility. The moment a clinical programmer touches her pacemaker, law enforcement gets a notification. On April 6th, day 65 of this investigation, someone sent 2 notes to TMZ. The first note claimed Nancy was dead. The second, from the same sender on the same morning, claimed the sender had seen her alive in Sonora, Mexico. Retired FBI agents called the notes fraudulent. The Bitcoin wallet associated with the ransom demands received 0 transactions. The contradiction between the two notes sent in the same communication window was the most obvious red flag. But the pacemaker data adds important context to evaluating that claim. The cardiac data from the 41-minute window shows that Nancy was alive, and her pacemaker was functioning at 2:28 in the morning of February 1st. The data shows sustained cardiac activity, and elevated but functioning through the entire 41-minute window. The sync stopped at 2:28, not because Nancy's heart stopped, but because the wireless connection between her device and the monitoring system was broken. Most likely because she was in a vehicle moving away from her home monitoring base unit, or because the base unit was disabled by the people who took her. The pacemaker data does not show cardiac arrest at 2:28. It does not show the device entering a post-mortem non-pacing mode. It shows a functioning heart in a significantly altered physiological state, most consistent with pharmacological sedation, at the moment the cloud sync broke. Nancy Guthrie was almost certainly alive at 2:28 in the morning of February 1st. What happened after 2:28 is what the internal device logs would reveal if investigators could access them. Those logs are only accessible when Nancy is found. The TMZ note claiming she is dead is inconsistent with what the pacemaker data shows at the last moment of recorded transmission. That does not prove she is currently alive. More than 2 months have passed since that last data point, but it does indicate that the person writing those notes to TMZ is not working from knowledge of the pacemaker data. They do not have access to what the device recorded. They are guessing, and their guess is inconsistent with the most medically rigorous evidence this investigation has produced. Pacemaker data has been used as evidence in criminal proceedings in the United States. It is a relatively recent development in forensic medicine, but there is established precedent. In 2018, an Ohio man was convicted of arson and insurance fraud, partly on the basis of pacemaker data that contradicted his account of the night his house burned down. The data showed he was physically active during the time he claimed to be asleep. His own heart gave him away. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the cardiac data serves a different but equally powerful function. There is no alibi to destroy because no suspect has been named publicly. What the data does in this case is reconstruct the crime. It fills in the 41-minute window that external surveillance could not cover. It documents the physiological reality of what Nancy experienced. It tells investigators not just that something happened, but how it unfolded over time. The arc of physiological evidence. See the fear response at 1:47, the sustained distress through the middle of the window, the movement patterns consistent with transportation, and the sedation signature in the final phase, together create a narrative of the abduction that no human witness and no physical evidence could have provided with the same level of precision. In a prosecution, that physiological narrative, explained clearly to a jury by a forensic cardiologist who can translate the data into plain language, is extraordinarily powerful. It is Nancy's own heart testifying to what was done to her. And that testimony cannot be cross-examined. It cannot be impeached. It cannot be claimed to be biased or mistaken. Her heart recorded what happened, and the FBI has that record. Understanding how this evidence would be used in court helps explain why the FBI has been so methodical about its handling. Pacemaker data in a criminal case establishes several things that are significant for prosecution. First, it documents that Nancy experienced acute physical distress during the 41-minute window. Second, it provides time-stamped physiological evidence consistent with the presence of a third party, the person or persons who took her. Third, the sedation pattern, if confirmed by additional analysis, would support charges related to the administration of a controlled substance. The sedation evidence is particularly significant from a prosecution standpoint. Administering a sedative to a victim during an abduction adds additional criminal charges in most federal and state jurisdictions. It speaks to premeditation and planning, and it narrows the profile of the perpetrator because acquiring and administering medical-grade sedating compounds requires access, knowledge, and a procurement trail. Prosecutors working with this kind of cardiac data will need to establish the chain of custody for the device records. They will need to present expert testimony from forensic cardiologists who can explain the data in terms a jury can understand. And they will need to connect the physiological record to the physical evidence at the scene. All of that groundwork is being laid right now by the FBI, by federal prosecutors in the District of Arizona, and by the forensic cardiac specialists who have been working this data for more than 2 months. Nancy Guthrie, at age 84 and in her overall health condition, she was almost certainly wearing or carrying at least one additional connected health monitoring device on the night she disappeared. Beyond the pacemaker, elderly individuals with cardiac conditions frequently use multiple health monitoring technologies: home blood pressure monitors with Bluetooth connectivity, continuous glucose monitors in diabetic patients, fall detection devices, medical alert wearables, remote patient monitoring devices prescribed by physicians. Any of these devices, if Nancy was wearing or had in proximity on the night of February 1st, would have generated its own data record, its own time-stamped log of physiological events, its own wireless transmission record showing when it last communicated with a paired device or cloud platform. And the FBI's forensic team has not publicly disclosed what additional devices were present in Nancy's home or what additional monitoring data they have been able to access beyond the pacemaker cloud data. The deliberate silence on this point suggests either that no additional relevant devices were present or that additional device data exists and is being protected as active investigative evidence. Given that Nancy was under ongoing medical care for cardiac issues significant enough to warrant an implanted pacemaker, and given the general level of connected health technology available and commonly used by patients in her situation, the latter possibility deserves serious consideration. If additional device data exists, it would supplement the pacemaker cardiac timeline with additional physiological and potentially movement data. And it would create a more complete forensic picture of those 41 minutes. And it would give prosecutors additional evidence streams to work with when charges are ultimately filed. The FBI knows exactly what devices were in that house. They conducted a forensic sweep of the property in the first days of the investigation. Every electronic device, every paired monitor, every Bluetooth-enabled appliance was cataloged. And the data from every one of those devices is part of the investigative record that has been building for more than 2 months. There is a time-sensitive dimension to the pacemaker situation that is important to address directly. Implanted pacemakers run on batteries. Those batteries are long-lasting, typically 5 to 15 years depending on the device model and how actively it is pacing. But they are not infinite, and they are not rechargeable in the traditional sense. When a pacemaker battery reaches the end of its service life, the device requires surgical replacement. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker has been functioning continuously since she disappeared. If her device was not near its replacement window before the abduction, the battery situation is not an immediate concern. But if her device was approaching or within its recommended replacement window, the situation becomes more urgent. More immediately relevant is this: even with a battery nowhere near depletion, the pacemaker's ability to pace effectively depends on factors beyond just the battery. The integrity of the leads connecting the device to the heart, the stability of the device's position in the body. In a patient who has experienced the kind of physical stress that Nancy's cardiac data suggests she experienced in those 41 minutes, lead stability is a legitimate clinical concern. Investigators and medical advisors working with the FBI on this case are acutely aware of the medical urgency overlaid on top of the investigative urgency. Finding Nancy is not just about answers and justice. It is about finding someone whose medical condition requires ongoing clinical attention and whose primary cardiac device is functioning without medical oversight in an unknown environment. Every day that passes without Nancy being found is another day her pacemaker operates without clinical monitoring. And the medical team advising the FBI has made very clear that this timeline has medical as well as investigative significance. The FBI has not held a press conference laying out the pacemaker data findings in plain language. That is not how federal investigations work while the case remains active. Every piece of information that law enforcement discloses publicly about their evidence and investigative findings is information that the person or people who took Nancy Guthrie also receive. Every press conference is also a briefing for the suspect. Every evidence disclosure is an opportunity for someone to destroy remaining evidence, change their behavior, or prepare a counter-narrative for a future legal defense. In a case where the primary suspect or suspects are still at large, where the investigation is active, and where the victim may still be alive. The calculus around public disclosure is extremely conservative. You do not disclose what you know, but you do not disclose how you know it. You do not disclose what you are looking for or where you are looking, because any of that information in the hands of the wrong person could compromise the investigation before it reaches resolution. The FBI's silence on the pacemaker data specifics is not a sign that they found nothing. It is a sign that what they found is significant enough to protect. Investigators who handle evidence carelessly in the public sphere do not get a second chance. The FBI is not being careless with the pacemaker data. They are being precise, methodical, and strategic. And every day that they maintain that strategic silence is a day they preserve the investigative advantage that Nancy's own heart gave them. Let me be direct about where this investigation stands and what it would take to produce an arrest. More than 2 months is a long time, and understanding the path forward requires an honest assessment of what investigators have and what they still need. The pacemaker data gives investigators a physiological reconstruction of the abduction and a constrained geographic search zone based on the movement data. That is significant, but physiological data alone does not produce an arrest. You need a suspect. You need to be able to place a specific person in that physiological narrative. The things that would connect a specific person to the pacemaker data and therefore break this case open fall into 4 categories. The first is the procurement trail for the sedating agent. If the cardiac data interpretation is correct, someone acquired a medical-grade compound to use in this abduction. That acquisition happened somewhere, or through a medical contact, a dark web marketplace, a diverted prescription, a theft from a medical facility. The FBI is following that trail, and trails like that, in an era of pharmaceutical tracking and prescribing monitoring programs, are very difficult to erase completely. The second is the cryptocurrency trail. The original $6 million ransom demand included a Bitcoin wallet address. That wallet is being watched. Every movement of funds is visible. If the actual kidnappers ever move or cash out from that wallet, the blockchain will record it, and investigators will see it. The third is DNA evidence. Law enforcement mentioned biological material collected from the scene in the early days of the investigation. Beyond the glove DNA that was traced and found to be unrelated, other material was collected, and the analysis of that material has never been publicly resolved. When DNA results are being this carefully protected, it typically means they are meaningful and prosecution-ready. The fourth is human intelligence. Someone knows something. Someone who is in a position to see, to hear, to be peripherally involved. Someone who has been carrying that knowledge for more than 2 months. The weight of that knowledge does not get lighter over time. It gets heavier. People talk, sometimes to law enforcement, sometimes to someone who tells someone who eventually calls a tip line. The $1 million reward from the Guthrie family is still active. And more than 2 months of conscience is a long time to hold something that heavy alone. Any one of those 4 things could produce a break in this case within hours of a development. The FBI knows all 4 of them. They are working all 4 simultaneously. And the pacemaker data sits at the center of all 4 because it is the forensic foundation that every other piece of evidence will eventually be measured against. If you have any information, any detail, however small, that relates to what happened on the night of January 31st into February 1st in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, the FBI wants to hear from you. The tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. You can submit anonymously online at tips.fbi.gov. The $1 million reward from the Guthrie family is active. Legitimate information that leads to Nancy's recovery changes everything for a family that has been in agony for more than 2 months. And if you are in the medical or pharmaceutical community, if you encountered an unusual request for controlled sedating compounds in the weeks before or around February 1st, if something did not sit right with you at the time and has been sitting heavier since, that information is relevant. The FBI's healthcare fraud and medical forensics units work alongside the investigative team on cases that involve pharmaceutically sophisticated criminal operations. Your observation, however small it seemed at the time, could be the piece of the procurement trail that investigators are missing. do the right thing. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker recorded every heartbeat of those 41 minutes. The fear, the sustained distress, the movement. The final sedated silence before the sync stopped at 2:28. Her own heart. The heart that has been beating for 84 years recorded what was done to her. And the FBI has that record. The fake notes and the empty Bitcoin wallets and the noise of 2 months of fraudulent claims, none of that changes what is inside that data. None of that erases the physiological record of what Nancy's heart witnessed. The evidence is there. The investigation is active. And the forensic foundation the FBI has built from more than 2 months of painstaking cardiac data analysis is not going away. Someone will be held accountable for what those 41 minutes recorded. This is True Crime Dre. If you want to stay updated on this case and every development as it happens, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you do not miss a single update. And if this kind of deep evidence-focused coverage is what you come to True Crime for, leave a like on this video. It helps this content reach more people who care about cases like Nancy's. Nancy Guthrie is still out there, her pacemaker is still recording, and somewhere in the data, in the procurement trails, in the DNA, in the conscience of someone who knows, is the answer that will bring her home.